All right, number 7. This is from Jeff Wide. He says in the NIV, in John 9:41, Jesus says, if you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. What does he mean by blind in this context? Does this blindness also cover sin? Okay, great question. Let's go to the passage. John 9:41. And I will look at the NIV. I think a variety of translations is good for us to use. So I'm going to back up. Notice I always do this, you guys. I always back up. This is what you should do too, right? Like you back up and read the context. This is just how you think biblically. I try to find like, oh, here's a section beginning in verse 35. Jesus, and you can ignore the title, right? Because you haven't read the passage yet. Don't let the title tell you what it's about before you've read it. The titles are added by the translators. Jesus heard that they had thrown him out. And this was a man who was born blind that Jesus healed earlier on in John, and they kick him out of the synagogue, I believe, this, if I remember the story correctly. So they kicked him out, and he went and found him, and he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? Who is he, sir? The man asked. Tell me so that I may believe him. Yeah, the guy was blind, and Jesus healed him, but he didn't stick around. So he didn't get to actually find out more about Jesus. So Jesus shows up. Do you believe in the Son of Man? Which is Jesus's really important Davidic title he's got there. So Jesus says, you have now seen him. And that's beautiful because the guy was blind, and he's telling, as he's looking at Jesus, he's like, you've now seen him. Like, you've seen me. Now you know the guy that heals you. In fact, he's the one speaking with you. Then the man said, Lord, I believe, and he worshiped him. Jesus said, for judgment I've come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind. Okay, he's obviously making a metaphor here. The blind is going to see, but the blind man didn't catch the story. If we back up the story a bit, he didn't just go from blindness to sight. He went from not knowing who the Son of Man was to seeing the Son of Man and believing in him. So he went from a physical blindness to physical sight, and he also went from a spiritually being unaware of who the Son of Man was. Right? He had only partial knowledge of the revelation of God through the Old Testament, but he didn't know Jesus yet, to knowing Jesus and seeing him and worshiping him. So the blind has seen in physical and spiritual ways, and then those who see will become blind. So the blind saw spiritually, and those who see physically, they'll become blind. That is those who have more capacities, who seem to be the ones with the knowledge and with the wisdom, they will be seen as blind. They'll become blind or unaware of the spiritual realities of Christ. Now we're going to read where you have your question. Some Pharisees who were with him heard him say this and asked, what? Are we blind too? Okay, the Pharisees are, like most people, very aware when they're being passive-aggressively insulted. and Jesus kind of did that here. It's not always wrong to be that way, right? Jesus does it. Mostly, I do. Whenever I do it, it's wrong. But yeah, what are we blind to? And they're trying to confront him. Usually, they do this because they want to get him to say something directly to them to get him in trouble. Jesus says then, if you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. So again, there's a metaphor in the verse between physical blindness and spiritual blindness. I think when Jesus, my opinion now, I think when Jesus says, if you were blind, I think he means spiritually unaware. If you were, in fact, blindness or vision is the ability to see a thing, right? So if you did not have the ability to see the truth of who Christ is, you wouldn't be guilty of rejecting him. That's the guilt. Ultimately, the guilt is associated with whether they accept or reject Jesus. This has implications for those who are mentally incapable of comprehending the truths of Christ, for little children and babies who they don't have the vision, the awareness, the ability to understand and comprehend the gospel. I have a video on the salvation of children that I talk about this kind of thing. So I think that's what he's saying. If you were spiritually or mentally incapable of comprehending who I am, fine, you would not be guilty. But now you claim you can see, your guilt remains. Here's you, not only rejecting Jesus, not being aware of him, not only not being aware of Jesus, but being aware of him, saying that you have discernment about him and rejecting him. That's a higher guilt. And there are different degrees of guilt. And I think that answers the question. I think it probably makes pretty good sense. You asked finally, last part of your question, Jeff, was, does this blindness also cover sin? And again, I want to just differentiate between covering sin or getting rid of sin or, that kind of thing versus just making someone unaccountable. So a person who cannot comprehend something isn't covered for the sin of rejecting the thing because they didn't reject it. They just couldn't comprehend it. Their blindness made them unaccountable. So if I hold up a stop sign and a person with vision walks by, they're accountable for not stopping. A blind person walks by, they're not accountable for anything because they couldn't see it. But if I said stop, then they could hear it. Then you see, this is just about accountability, not how I deal with my sin. There just isn't a sin for the person who simply didn't know. Not that there aren't other sins. There isn't the sin of rejecting Jesus, though. There isn't the sin of purposely turning away from Christ without the knowledge of him. There are other things God reveals to you about creation, about conscience, and we can be judged on those things even when we don't know Christ. I feel like I'm bringing up questions in your mind right now, listeners, about what about those who never hear the gospel? And I have a teaching I've done on that. If I could get Sarah or one of the mods to put in the comments right now the video, what about those who never hear the gospel? And I'll put a link down below too. That's a good follow-up for this question for those who are interested.